Have you ever heard the assertion that gender-affirming care is non-essential and therefore shouldn't be covered by national health services or insurance providers? Where does that claim come from? How did the US government fabricate a report to justify this narrative? And what does the science actually show us? That's what we'll be tackling in today's video. But first, a quick content warning for the following: transmedia, hate speech, medical violence, and sexual violence. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so that we can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and it's time to debunk the assertion that gender-affirming care is non-essential and therefore shouldn't be covered by national health services or insurance providers. And it's important to do so, seeing the current attacks upon gender-affirming care around the world. This includes my country of origin, the UK, where not only have children been stripped of fully reversible and clinically safe puberty blockers, but local GPs have openly denied their patients HRT on grounds of personal beliefs. This includes trans adults who have undergone a gonadectomy, meaning their body produces practically no natural sex hormone, putting them at risk of extreme osteoporosis and muscle wastage. And one of the arguments I've heard trying to justify this denial of care is that it is non-essential, with said people often referring to it as purely cosmetic, implying that it is frivolous and thus a luxury. This is often accompanied by demands to know why their taxpayer money should go towards medical services for transgender people, an argument I hear especially frequently when defending trans prisoners. This is an argument that has existed in the general discourse since at least 2013, when proposed changes to Medicare and Medicaid in the US were mocked as, quote, Obamacare funding free cosmetic sex changes, end quote, clearly trivializing said medical needs. And I bring up US history since, sadly, a lot of the discussion today is defined by the US, with said nation being a cultural cornerstone for many topics, including the medical needs of trans people. Fact is, if you go back to the 1970s and earlier, whilst there was no federal standard, state funds were being used to help trans people medically transition in the US on a case-by-case basis. This is something that surprises a lot of people, since we tend to have this very forward-looking, march to progress view of human rights, where things were the worst they've ever been in the distant past and have slowly gotten better with time. Except, things are rarely that simple. When trans people began getting recognition on the global stage, they weren't viewed as inhuman monsters but scientific wonders, a miracle of the modern age, as seen in early coverage of Zenit Kobek, a trans man, and Christine Jorgensen, a trans woman. Sadly, it wasn't long before the gender-critical narratives we've all come to know were invented, forged in the fires of bigotry and intolerance. Enter Janice Raymond, who can be considered the mother of gender-critical fascism. Raymond published her magnum opus of hate, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male, in 1979. This book was set much of the discourse we see gender-critical fascists regurgitating today, with Raymond hand-waving trans men as little more than a distraction, in asserting that, quote, the female to constructed male transsexual is the token that saves face for the male transsexual empire. She is the buffer zone who can be used to promote the universalist argument that transsexualism is a supposed human problem, not uniquely restricted to men. She is a living proof that some women supposedly want the same thing. However, proof wanes when it is observed that women were not the original, nor are they the present agents of the process. Nor are the stereotypes of masculinity that female-to-constructed male transsexual incarnates products of a female-directed culture. Rather, women have been assimilated into the transsexual world as women are assimilated into other male-defined worlds, institutions, and roles, that is, on men's terms, and thus as tokens." End quote. Presenting trans men as assimilated victims, exploited by trans women to shield against criticism. As for trans women, Raymond had a lot to say, including the following. Quote, "All transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves. However, the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist violates women's sexuality and spirit as well. Rape, although it is usually done by force, can also be accomplished by deception. It is significant that in the case of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist, often he is able to gain entrance and a dominant position in women's spaces because the women involved do not know he is a transsexual and he just does not happen to mention it. The question of deception must also be raised in the context of how transsexuals who claim to be lesbian feminists obtain surgery in the first place. Since all transsexuals have to pass as feminine in order to qualify for surgery, so-called lesbian feminist transsexuals either had to lie to the therapist and doctors or they had a conversion experience after surgery. I am highly dubious of such conversions, and the other alternative, deception, raises serious problems, of course. Deception reaches a tragic point for all concerned if transsexuals become lesbian feminists because they regret what they have done and cannot back off on the effects of irreversible surgery, for example, castration. Thus they revert to masculinity, but not male body appearance, by becoming the man within the woman, and more, within the women's communities, getting back their maleness in the most insidious way, by seducing the spirits and the sexuality of women who do not relate to men. Because transsexuals have lost their physical members does not mean they have lost their ability to penetrate women, women's mind, women's space, women's sexuality. Transsexuals merely cut off the most obvious means of invading women so that they seem non-invasive. However, as Mary Daly has remarked, in the case of the transsexually constructed lesbian feminist, their whole presence becomes a member, invading women's presence and dividing us once more from each other." End quote. Presenting trans women as an existential threat, an invader of womanhood, lying to their doctors in order to trick them into giving out gender-affirming surgeries before going on to rape cis lesbians. We recently put out a video on the updated variant of this myth surrounding the cotton sealing and apparent trans femme/cis lesbian antagonism, proving how, in spite of what the bigots assert, the overwhelming majority of cis lesbians, between 84 and 94% depending on their generation, openly support their trans sisters. And I am currently working on a video about trans people engaging in supposed rape by deception, but I wanted to get this one done first. That video will be added to the Debunking Gender-Critical Fascism playlist once it's finished. As for what Raymond thought should be done about trans people, she very openly declared that, quote, "I contend that the problem of transsexualism would be best served by morally mandating it out of existence. Does a moral mandate, however, necessitate that transsexualism must be legally mandated out of existence? What is the relationship between law and morality in the realm of transsexualism? While there are many who feel that morality must be built into law, I believe that the elimination of transsexualism is not best achieved by legislation prohibiting transsexual treatment and surgery, but rather by legislation that limits it and by other legislation that lessens the support given to sex role stereotyping, which generated the problem to begin with." End quote. I wonder what she could mean by legislation that limits it. Sadly, we didn't have to wait long to find out, as explained by trans historian Kristen Williams. Raymond's work caught the attention of someone at the National Center for Healthcare Technology, or NCHT, a government-funded body in the US that was looking to cut costs from Medicare and Medicaid by reducing the number of medications and procedures that could be claimed as essential. And one of the things it was looking to cut was gender-affirming care for trans people. They just needed to present a case to show that said care was controversial, experimental, and expensive. That is why the NCHT approached Raymond, who is not a clinician, to commission a report about the social ethicality of said care, which was published in 1980 and contained no research whatsoever, merely being a rehash of her non-peer-reviewed book. This report was then referenced directly by the Office of Health Technology Assessment in a 1981 review, being one of two citations invoked in order to prove that trans care was controversial. The other citation on that specific claim? Why, a book review of Janice Raymond's 1979 book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male. So the only proof that said care was controversial was the opinion of a single anti-trans bigot who was sought out because she was a known anti-trans bigot who openly believed that all trans women were sadistic rapists. Sadly, the corrupt assessment was a success, leading gender-affirming care to be classed as non-essential and therefore not covered under either Medicare or Medicaid. Yet things only got worse since private insurers could and did invoke the government's ruling to argue that they shouldn't be forced to cover it under essential care, setting said standard as the norm for the US, which was then adopted by other countries around the world. What really stuck out to me as I returned to this topic in 2025 was just how familiar this entire thing was. We have covered the Cass review extensively on this channel, showing how its author, Dr. Hilary Cass, lied about pre-existing research and indeed even her own methodology. We also provided evidence that Cass had a known anti-trans bias going in, pushing gender-critical propaganda onto her colleagues, and that the then Tory government boasted that it had deliberately stacked health institutions with anti-trans bigots because it knew the Cass review couldn't stand actual scrutiny. It's hard not to see the similarities between what's happening in the UK right now and what was done in the US during the 80s. Governments have always sought out biased researchers to help them manufacture consent when it comes to stripping trans people of essential care. Speaking of essential care, that just leads us to discuss what the science actually shows. Note that a lot of the studies I'm about to share focus on gender-affirming care for trans youth, since, in my experience, this is the most controversial form of gender-affirming care. I have never met someone who thought gender-affirming care was essential for trans youth that didn't also feel the same regarding said care for adults. I'd also just like to note that these first few studies were lined up by Rebecca Watson or Skeptic in her 2023 video debunking Sabine Hossenfelder's anti-trans pseudoscience. The first study we're going to take a look at, titled Association of Gender-Affirming Hormone Therapy with Depression, Thoughts of Suicide and Attempted Suicide Among Transgender and Non-Binary Youth, was published in the Journal of Adolescent Health in April of 2022 and found that the, quote, use of gender-affirming hormone therapy was associated with lower odds of recent depression and seriously considering suicide compared to those who wanted gender-affirming hormone therapy but did not receive it. For youth under age 18, gender-affirming hormone therapy was associated with lower odds of recent depression and of a past year suicide attempt." End quote. Another study, Mental Health Outcomes in Transgender and Non-Binary Youths Receiving Gender-Affirming Care, which was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association Open Network in February of 2022, found that, quote, in 104 trans and non-binary youths aged 13 to 20 years, receipt of gender-affirming care, including puberty blockers and gender-affirming hormones, was associated with 60% lower odds of moderate or severe depression and 73% lower odds of suicidality over a 12-month follow-up. End quote. We also have pubertal suppression for transgender youth and risk of suicidal ideation, which was published in Pediatrics in February of 2020 and found that, quote, a significant inverse association, as one increases the other decreases, between treatment with pubertal suppression during adolescence and lifetime suicidal ideation among transgender adults who ever wanted this treatment. These results align with past literature, suggesting that pubertal suppression for transgender adolescents who want this treatment is associated with favorable mental health outcomes. End quote. The last study Rebecca brought up was psychological profile of the first sample of transgender youth presenting for medical intervention in a US pediatric gender center, published in 2017 in the American Psychological Association's Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity, which found that, quote, older trans and non-binary youth seeking medical intervention experience poor self-competence, higher levels of anxiety, and decreased happiness and satisfaction than the younger patients. The results provide further evidence of the resiliency of a significant number of transgender youth, as well as the severity of mental health concerns for others. New to the existing literature are the results showing older transgender teenagers as more distressed, supporting the clinical recommendation to consider earlier medical intervention for appropriate youth, and to always incorporate mental health support and assessment. End quote. Again, thanks to Rebecca for lining those up so neatly. Adding to our studies, we also have psychological functioning in transgender adolescents before and after gender affirmative care compared with cisgender general population peers, which was published in the Journal of Adolescent Health in April of 2020 and found that, quote, transgender adolescents receiving puberty suppression had fewer emotional and behavioral problems than the group that had just been referred to transgender care and had similar or fewer problems than their same age cisgender peers on the youth self-report domains. End quote. Next, we have psychological support, puberty suppression, and psychological functioning in adolescents with gender dysphoria, published in November of 2015 in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, which found that, quote, at baseline, gender dysphoric adolescents showed poor functioning. Gender dysphoric adolescents' global functioning improved significantly after 6 months of psychological support. Moreover, gender dysphoric adolescents who also received puberty suppression had significantly better psychological functioning after 12 months of puberty blockers compared with when they had received only psychological support. End quote. I like this one as not only does it have a control, but it has a comparison group who had not yet begun puberty blockers and were only receiving psychological support, providing us evidence that puberty blockers offer a specific benefit, not just receiving general care. I think the last study I'll give relating to gender-affirming care for trans youth specifically is one that tackles surgery in young adults who had previously been on blockers, titled Young Adult Psychological Outcome After Puberty Suppression and Gender Reassignment, published in Pediatrics in October of 2014, which found that, quote, after gender reassignment, in young adulthood, the gender dysphoria was alleviated and psychological functioning had steadily improved. Well-being was similar to or better than same-age young adults from the general population. Improvements in psychological functioning were positively correlated with post-surgical subjective well-being, end quote, which led the authors to write in its conclusion that, quote, a clinical protocol of multidisciplinary team with mental health professionals, physicians, and surgeons, including puberty suppression, followed by cross-sex hormones and gender reassignment surgery, provides gender dysphoric youth who seek gender reassignment from early puberty on the opportunity to develop into well-functioning adults, end quote. I'd hope that we'd all agree that empowering trans people to develop into well-functioning young adults is the standard we should be aiming for. Moving on from studies focusing on trans youth, we have gender-affirming surgery improves mental health outcomes and decreases antidepressant use in patients with gender dysphoria, which was published in February of 2024 in Plastic Reconstructive Surgery, and found that, quote, a total of 3,134 patients with gender dysphoria were included in each cohort. Patients in the surgery group had overall lower rates of mental health conditions, substance misuse, and antidepressant use. There was an absolute decrease of 8.8% in antidepressant prescription after gender-affirming plastic surgery, and significant decreases were found in post-operative depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation and attempts, alcohol misuse, and drug misuse, end quote. Then we have association between gender-affirming surgeries and mental health outcomes, which was published in April of 2021 in the Journal of the American Medical Association Surgery, and found that, quote, transgender people with a history of gender-affirming surgery had significantly lower odds of past-month psychological distress, past-year tobacco smoking, and past-year suicidal ideation compared with transgender people with no history of gender-affirming surgery, end quote. And I could continue, especially after finding a 2018 meta-analysis by Cornell University, which compiled over 55 studies, 51 of which showed a significant improvement in well-being of trans people who had medically transitioned, and only 4 of which showed conflicting or null results. So if you still want more evidence, there's a good place to start. This forms quite the consensus, demonstrating that trans people who receive support in being allowed to medically transition show significantly better health than their peers who didn't, bringing them up to and sometimes even surpassing the baseline set by their cisgender peers. That is a massive improvement in quality of life, one trans people have as much right to as any cisgender individual, marking said care as essential. Though, what do you think? Have you come across this claim, and if so, where? What do you think are the similarities between Raymond and Hilary Cass? Are you a trans person who has transitioned? Would you mind sharing the way it's impacted your life? Do you know of any other anti-trans myths you'd like to receive their own standalone debunking? Did I miss something you noticed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Flynn, Bo Ayer, Deborah Goldsmith, Higgins Siegel, Jackie Sins, Mix Alba, and Peter Cole. And from myself, Adita, and Levi, take care now.